help me welcome John Wood.
Which way?
Whichever you prefer.
You're the boss.
You sit.
Okay.
I love it. So welcome.
Thank you.
In a way, welcome home to Colorado.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you. We're pleased to have you. We're really honored. And
Go Buffs.
yeah, I love it.
Any Buffs in the audience?
Just a few.
Good.
We're nonpartisan,
Colorado State, Colorado College.
Thanks.
Love
Thank
them
you.
all. Love them all.
Thank you. So we're so honored to have you here today, and it really leads to my first question, which is sort of why are you here today and not serving as an international executive at Microsoft, which sounds like a pretty good gig to many people. So what would make you leave that?
So I was very fortunate that I joined Microsoft in 1991. It was a young company. I joined 3 years after the IPO, unfortunately, which affected my fundraising strategy in a big way. But I joined Microsoft in 91, and I was very fortunate because the company was growing, and the more the company grew overseas, the more they were looking for executives who were willing to get on a plane and fly to Taiwan, fly to South Africa, fly to Dubai, whatever it be. And I grew up, my parents and I grew up as a big traveler. And it was in 1998 that I took this trip that changed my life. I had hit my 7-year anniversary with Microsoft, and I wasn't married, so my 7-year itch had to be my 7-year anniversary with Microsoft. I needed to just get out. And there was a rumor that if you went high enough in the Himalayas, you could escape the sound of Steve Ballmer yelling at you to work harder. And so I decided to give that a shot. And I went off to Nepal on an 18-day trek. How many of you, I know Colorado's a huge mountaineering state. How many of you have traveled in Nepal? Probably, I'm guessing at least 10% of you have. You know, it's a country that's very beautiful, but it's also a country of crushing poverty. And it's not just poverty, it's poverty of opportunity. Kids, if you're born there, you've really lost the lottery of life. You're born in one of the world's poorest nations. You're born in a place with illiteracy rates above 70%. I didn't know any of this, but I was asked by a headmaster, do you want to come visit my school? And so on day 2 of my trek, I was very lucky that I got to go see this local kind of ramshackle rundown school with dirt floors and a sheet metal roof. And the headmaster took me to see the school's library. And it was a library in name only. It was a big empty room where theoretically a library could have existed, but they didn't have any children's books. They had 450 students, but no children's books. And I asked the headmaster why, and he said, well, we have a few books that backpackers have left behind, right? So you have like Danielle Steele romance novels and stuff like that. Like no kid should really be subject to reading. And I asked him why, and he said, well, in Nepal, we are too poor to afford education. But until we have education, we're always going to remain poor. And that just struck me at a gut level that my grandfather could have said that same thing. I was born poor, therefore I had to drop out of school. Because I didn't get educated, I'm going to remain poor. And that is kind of like the topic, I think, of a lot of poverty in the world today. It's not that people are lazy or dumb, right? We're all born with the same gray matter. It's just the lottery of life. To whom you are born and where you are born are the 2 biggest determinants of what you become as a young person. But these are completely random events of where you're born and to whom you are born. So the headmaster spoke a sentence that would forever change my life. He said, perhaps, sir, you will someday come back with books. I got excited. I thought there's a reason to come back to this community and come back a year and trek. So a year later, with my father made this his retirement project. We had 6 donkeys with 3,000 books. And we went back to Nepal and delivered the books. And it was the biggest day in the history of the village. These kids had never seen brightly colored children's books before. And when we took the books off the donkeys, we wanted the kids to all queue up and each accept the books and walk them into the library. And of course, the queuing thing didn't work. It was like the kids were stage diving. It was like a mosh pit. It was like literacy palooza. These kids had never seen children's books before. And so as we were watching the kids stage dive in the books, I thought, this is like the happiest day of my life, right? I've found something that is more meaningful than making a bunch of shareholders richer, right? Which is really what Microsoft is all about, is let's just make our shareholders wealthier. And I was happy to do that at a certain point. But then when I sat down with my dad that night and we talked about it, I said, Dad, this is like a drop in the ocean. It's one library in a world where 773 million people are illiterate. And so I thought about it and I thought, you know, this is your theme, the power of a big idea. One of the Microsoft, Steve Ballmer, our very voluble CEO, used to say, go big or go home. And I thought one library is not enough, 10's not enough, 100's not enough in a world with 773 million illiterate people. So I quit Microsoft, I kind of jumped out of the airplane and prayed that my parachute would deploy. And in 1999, I quit and started this group called Room to Read. And I often joke that I did not make enough money at Microsoft to start a foundation. I made enough money to start a charity or an NGO.
That's amazing. I would call that in our conversation about big ideas quite a big idea. So since then, so that was 1999, you leave and you have this great idea. Tell us about Room to Read and where it's come from then.
Well, I mean, I'm very proud of the fact that Room to Read comes from very humble beginnings. If I had, millions of dollars to give away, I don't think I would have really built a coalition. So my goal very early on was to say, anybody anywhere in the world can be a change agent through this group called Room to Read. Nobody really knew who we were. My status was gone. I no longer got phone calls, returns. I no longer had a fancy business card and a fancy title. And I just kind of set out to just travel the world and say to people, for $5,000, we can open a library in a country like Nepal or Cambodia or Vietnam that serves 400 children. So it's not a lot of money. For $300, we can put a girl in the developing world on a long-term scholarship, because in the developing world today, 2/3 of those who are out of school are girls and women. And we all know that when society does not educate its women and young women, something's missing. When the world is full of a generation of educated butt-kicking women, that's when things really change, right? And I know that because I was raised by an educated butt-kicking mother who kept me in line and read to me. And so, but the story of Room to Read really is that we just started from very humble beginnings. My team and I traveled the world and said, one school at a time, one library at a time, one long-term girls scholarship at a time. Let's put some big runs on the board. Let's think big about this issue. So where we are today is we have over 31,000 girls who have been on long-term scholarship in our program. We guarantee every one of those girls will stick with them to the end of secondary school as long as they pass to the next grade. 96% of them pass every year, which is incredible, because if you're born poor, female, in a rural village, in a poor country to uneducated parents, you have 5 strikes against you. The world expects you to fail. These girls don't. These girls succeed. 73% of our graduates have moved on to university and tertiary education, and this is in difficult countries like India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Zambia. We've opened now 1,900 schools. We've opened 18,000 libraries. So we're, yeah. Our role model was Andrew Carnegie. He opened 2,500 libraries in his lifetime. So we're now 6x Carnegie. We actually, in our first decade, we actually opened libraries faster than Starbucks opened coffee outlets in their first decade after the IPO. And that is the power of an idea, is even as a nonprofit, you can think big and say, okay, if the world needs a good latte, the world damn well needs literacy. So let's try to out Starbucks, let's try to out Howard Schultz, and let's try to out Starbucks, and let's try to out Carnegie, Andrew Carnegie. We put 16 million books in the hands of kids. And I was in Cambodia about 2 weeks ago, and we celebrated a milestone. Our original goal for Room to Read was to reach 10 million children by 2020. It was a big, hairy, audacious goal that nobody believed. I was told that was a crazy, hubristic goal. But we thought, well, we're not going to know if we don't try. Don't listen to the critics. Don't listen to the cynics. We said, thank you for your advice, but we're going to try it anyway. We reached our 10 millionth student this year, 5 years early. So we've upped our, yeah.
So I think when you hear all that, we all go, okay, well, it's obvious this guy needed to leave Microsoft and do this, right? Like, this was destined to be. But, I've had the pleasure of reading this book, and I hope you all will have a chance to pick up the book. We have them here today. It's a great read. And part of what you talk about that I loved, I think lots of us can imagine, like, going off and doing something big, right? You have an idea, and you think you could do it. But you come to that moment where you're about to, like, quit your job. And, I think in the book you said, you hoped that you would be decisive enough to make a big leap into the unknown. Can you just talk about that moment where you're like, I'm headed out of here, I'm going to go do this, and how that felt and how you got past that moment that I think that stops a lot of people from pursuing their big idea?
Yeah, and I delayed for a while, right? There was a long delay between my father's and my trip to Nepal. Opening that first library in the little village of Bahundan, probably about 3 months went by before I really worked up the courage. And I'd read books, I had written in my journal, I had been whinging to my friends.
People are laughing because we have stewed on our big ideas for like 30 years. Oh. And you're like, whoa, I really had to ponder this for 3 months. Anyway, continue.
Yeah. So I was living in Beijing, director of business development for Microsoft Greater China. And my ultimate boss, the guy I reported to, Michael, was the director of the region. And I just walked in the office one day, and I was kind of like, this is it. And I filled my coffee cup, and I went and I knocked on his door, and I walked in, and I said, you are not going to like what I'm about to tell you. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you. Then I'm going to leave for the day. And then tomorrow we can discuss this. And he gave me this really quizzical look, and I said, I quit. I'm leaving. I can't do this anymore. And he said, what? He wanted to start talking. I said, I don't really want to talk about this. And he very quickly let me know that he felt betrayed and da-da-da-da-da-da. And I said, I'm really sorry, but I literally walked out, and I went to my local tea house near the office in Beijing and pulled out my journal. And I was like, holy, I did it. I did it. I did it. I'm out. I'm out. And now I can pursue my dream. A friend of mine gave me some advice. He said, you probably have all heard this one, the Band-Aid story. There's 2 ways to remove a Band-Aid, slowly and painfully, or quickly and painfully. So I went for quick but painful.
Love it. I also hear coffee before and tea after. Big move. So.
Caffeine helps to get things done.
Yeah, for sure. So most truly, audacious ideas and endeavors, which I would say something of this size is, most of those don't just go along. You've talked a lot about the successes, and those are truly inspiring. But to get there, I'm sure there were bumps in the road and some struggles. Could you talk about the early days and some of your challenges that you faced and how you overcame those?
Yeah, I think in the early days, the hardest part for me was that I went from having a title and having people return my emails, or if I wanted to get a meeting with somebody, I could get a meeting, to suddenly knocking on doors and people were saying, John who, room to what? I've not heard from you. I had foundations where they're like, oh, there's a million little groups like you out there trying to help kids. There's millions of you. And I said, well, we're not going to be a little group. We're going to be a very, very big group. And I think what I learned along the way is basically don't listen to those who tell you why you can't do your goal. There's a quote, I believe it's from Sibelius, that nobody ever erected a statue in honor of a critic. It's true, right? You honor the leaders, the composers, the musicians, the artists. Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Mandela, they have statues, and they should have statues. And then every time that somebody bet on me, I just then said, thank you so much, thank you, thank you, thank you. Who else do you know? So Bill Draper, Robin Richards, prominent venture capitalists in the Bay Area, they gave us our first 6-figure grant. They wrote the check unrestricted, which I'd recommend people think about doing unrestricted grants. If you believe in the organization, believe in it. We recorded on film the 40% of you who did not applaud that sentiment. But what I did basically is every time that somebody bet on me, I basically just said, or bet on us, I basically said, who else in your network can you introduce us to? And we went with a very direct, pragmatic model. We basically said X number of dollars builds a school, Y number of dollars opens a library. You can do this as a group, as a church, as a synagogue. You can do this as a company. You can do this as a family. And we did a direct adopt a project model. And the idea behind that was that anybody would know exactly where their school was because they could go visit it. We would send them photographs. We would send them a report. So we would hold ourselves accountable to say, we're not just going to take your $30,000 and say, we hope a school is going to magically appear in the Mekong Delta of Vietnam. We say, you can touch it, taste it, visit it. We're going to send you pictures. And then we set something up that I really loved, which was to basically put up a dedication plaque. So if you wanted to dedicate something to your loved one, if your mom's turning 70, maybe it's your 50th anniversary, maybe it's your dad's 80th birthday, people would then start doing schools and libraries in honor of a loved one. And I would often joke at fundraising events that if in your family you suffer from sibling rivalry, this is like the nuclear option. That if you do something in honor of your parents, oh my, you're like the star kid for months on end.
That's adorable. Is this true? Yes. So something that you and I had the chance to talk about, people in this room, you heard our founders talk about what an important tool they thought advocacy was, and having a strong advocate for kids would be to support systems supporting children. as somebody who is working in a pretty direct service model, right? You're like helping serve kids directly, on the ground. Do you have thoughts about advocacy and improving systems? And has that been any part of your work at Room to Read? Or do you have any stories about that?
Yeah, I was originally suspicious of advocacy because I was a pragmatist and I wanted to just put runs on the board. I wanted to say we've opened X number of libraries and Y number of schools and we have this many girls in our long-term girls education program. But what we realized probably about 5 years in was we could only be as strong as our government partners. The Room to Read model is not one of us going into a community and doing something for them. We don't believe in a handout. We believe in the hand up. So our model has always been that if a school is going to get built, we require the community to put sweat equity into each project. They might carry the bags of cement from the roadside up the mountain trail. They might come out and dig the foundation for the school building. Parents will come and they'll build the bookshelves, they'll paint the walls of the library. And then the governments, through the Ministry of Education, are our partners, and we require them to sign a memorandum of understanding that when we build a school or open a library or start running a literacy program, they will provide trained teachers and trained librarians to that project and pay the ongoing salaries, which is one way we build sustainability in, that the government is then held accountable for that. We did have an interesting experience with advocacy, though, in Cambodia. I don't know if people have traveled in Cambodia, but really sad place. Obviously, the Khmer Rouge, there was a Holocaust. They killed 1.8 million people. If you were educated, you were first to be executed. Those who could get out of the country got out. Those who didn't have connections stayed in. And it's a country that's really trying to rebuild itself, literally from the ashes, from the ground up. But our country director, Carl Khan, who is himself a Khmer Rouge survivor, he lost both his parents on day one of the Holocaust when he was 12 years old. He's our country director for Cambodia, doing amazing work. We've opened over 2,000 libraries in Cambodia alone. And what we found out was that the librarians were not super motivated because the government, somebody in the government had the bright idea that librarians should be paid half the salary of teachers. And so what, of course, happens then is they felt half as valued, they felt half as motivated, if not less than half as motivated. So Carl realized that all the money we were putting into the libraries was not going to be leveraged and was not going to have a high return on investment if the government was not doing its job with the librarians. So he put together a coalition with 2 other education NGOs, so we didn't go into the ministry alone, and advocated, and at the national level, legislation was signed and the budget was approved to actually raise every single librarian's salary in the entire country up to the same level as the teachers. So that was a pragmatic advocacy, I think.
I appreciate that. I think sometimes people think about those things as being very separate, like, oh, I could support direct service or I could support advocacy, and they really do, when they're working best, work together. So.
But I do think with advocacy, it's really good if people are pitching advocacy to say, we are going to try to advocate change X so that thing Y happens, and then we're going to be able to produce data to show whether or not things are moving in that direction. Because if you just say, I think if people just say advocacy, people are going to think, okay, what are we going to do? We're going to pay lobbyists. We're going to not know where the money goes. So I'm a really big fan, I know you and I talked about this yesterday in the car ride in from the airport, a big fan of pragmatic advocacy, to be able to say, for example, the Cambodian example, here's what we are trying to achieve. And on a very small budget, we can achieve some pretty big results.
Thank you. You're speaking the language of our founders, so love hearing that. So, one of the things I had a chance to spend, we talked about this some time in Nepal recently, and one of the things I thought was interesting is, you bring, in the work that you do, you're bringing so much to Nepal and to the children and families of Nepal. But, when I was there, I also thought, I was struck by how much I was bringing back, some of the lessons. And some of them were even things like, we talked to a doctor there and he said, every child here is immunized. Like, why would you even talk about that? Like, it's free, and it's done, and we do it. Great. So this is Nepal, right? I mean, you're in a place that, like, the electricity is going on and off while we're talking. And he's like, are you kidding with the immunizations thing? So, there were just some really interesting things that they did there, and just sort of the spirit in which they worked together. And I wonder if you could share any lessons that you've learned from the countries that you're working in that you've brought back into your work.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think one of the things that makes Nepal special, I think, is that people take nothing for granted. It's a poor country. The government has been very ineffective. They only recently got their first constitution. But what that means is that at the community level, there's a certain sense of pragmatism, of you're not just waiting for Godot. You're not just saying, well, the government has to do this for me. I'm entitled to this, I'm entitled to that. In Nepal, people, I think, realize that if they're going to if they want something done, they're going to have to really roll up their sleeves and get it done. And in a certain sense, it makes our work a pleasure, because if I went into a community, let's say in the developed world, you know, and said, we want to expand the school, improve the school, but we're going to require the parents to put labor into the project, we'd be told 16 times how crazy we were that we were going to be doing something and making that labor mandatory. There are probably people who tell us there's some kind of law against it. What we're doing in places like Cambodia, South Africa, Nepal is very much of a self-help model, where we're saying to the community, with all due respect, we can't want this more than you want it. And I think too often in the developing world, the local people are treated as passive aid recipients. Well-meaning groups are coming in with subsidized grain, used T-shirts, let's give shoes away to kids. And all that really does is it just says to people, we don't believe that you have the work ethic to invest in your own solution. And so one of the reasons I feel very lucky that we get to work where we work is because we get to choose our countries very wisely, and we try to find places like Nepal where when we go in and say, we're going to want the community to co-invest in this project, it still takes some lobbying and it takes a lot of community meetings, but to us it's a non-negotiable. You can't help people who don't want to help themselves.
And I think when we think about advocacy at the systems level, that's an important lesson too, because I think there are a lot of opportunities that I think for systems to support people, but those things are more likely to happen when people are actively engaged and at the table and show that they're really interested in that. And I think, you know, one of the things that we have been thinking a lot about at the Children's Campaign is this idea of how we have communities and families that are impacted by the work we do actually engaged in our work at a very early level. And I'd just love to hear your advice on how you do that. How do you get people engaged when there's such diversity among the populations you serve? They're spread out so far. Like, how do you really bring those communities in early and connect in that way?
Yeah, well, our model, it's important because I love being a spokesperson for this cause, but our model is not, you know, American expats driving around the developing world in Land Rovers telling the local people what to do. Our model is one of community empowerment. So when those discussions are happening, it's Cambodian employees of Room to Read negotiating with the Cambodian communities. It's South Africans in South Africa. It's Tanzanians in Tanzania. 88% of our employees are local national. They're close to the kids, close to the customers, so they know how to get things done. They can discuss, negotiate, converse in the local language. They know the local customs. So that's a very important thing. And it's really fun to watch the byproducts of this happening. I was in a school in Zambia where they had over 1,000 kids, and Room to Read had helped them to open a library building. It was this probably 800 square foot building. It could hold about 70 kids at a time. And the parents were telling me, I painted those walls. The parents were telling us, we helped to build the bookshelves. And then one of the teachers came up to me, the librarian, Agnes, came up to me, and she said, but Mr. Wood, I also want to show you something else that's behind the library. I said, okay, what's behind the library? She goes, well, come, I'm going to show you the piggery. I said, the piggery? She said, yes, the piggery. And they had leftover cement from the library, so they decided, and I said, well, she goes, I'll tell you, come up. And so what had happened is there were a lot of HIV/AIDS orphans in this community, and they wanted to be able to give those kids scholarships to go to school. Very small amount of money, but to make sure those kids had uniforms and book bags and school lunch and things like that. And they decided as a community to come together, and they basically built the piggery. And then the teachers bought, like, I don't know if it was like the ratio was like 2 male pigs to 4 female pigs or something like that. But they then, every time there was a piglet, they sold the piglet. And the money from that piglet was then used to fund a scholarship for an HIV/AIDS orphan. And I love this because you never know where the ideas come from. You could never sit in an ivory tower and say, every library must have a piggery, because that would just seem like a crazy idea. But what was cool is this is literally the community, and it's all people in rural Zambia. This is the example, this is the idea they came up with. And one of the things I most love about doing what I do is I constantly am amazed that you'll have a school in rural Sri Lanka, and they'll have come up with some incredibly ingenious way to increase the budget they have to buy books through running their students in one of the schools. The 3rd graders and 4th graders every Friday would run a farmer's market. They would bring in whatever they had in their family's plot of land, bananas, coconuts, rice, whatever it would be, and then the local village residents would come and they would buy, and these kids were like little entrepreneurs, right? They're 4-year-olds selling bananas and 6-year-olds selling coconuts. And I said to the teacher, well, how much money did you raise today? She goes, well, we will not know till Monday. Why is that? She goes, oh, 5th grade math. They love to count the money, and we count the money on Mondays. But she pointed out that 3 of the 4 outside walls were painted, and the 4th outside wall was not yet painted. And the money from the little farmer's market the students ran was going to be used to buy paint to finish off that 4th wall. And I think that's the spirit that I think we need more of in the world, is just that, let's not talk about the obstacles, let's talk about the solutions, and let's be, I call it GSD mode, get stuff done mode. That's the PG-13 version. There's also an R-rated version of GSD. But I think the world needs more of that, of just that spirit of like, let's not talk about the reasons we can't make this happen. Let's just roll up our sleeves and get it done.
Appreciate that. I think while we've never had a piggery situation at the campaign, I do agree with you that every idea, like everything is better when there is community involvement from the get-go. And we talked about it yesterday. Like, we are a data-driven organization, but it's that combination of the data and then of the community's perspectives that, when it comes together, are the best ideas. So. Yeah,
and I think it creates a sense of pride in the community. I think it creates a sense of sustainability, because people will look at it and they'll view it as a community asset that they contributed to it. I mean, I've had families literally where they've given 50 rupees, which is under $1 US, into the school's the school library book fund. But it was a bigger sacrifice for that family in Nepal to give 50 rupees than it was for our donor, who donated $6,000 to open the library. And it's just, even if it's a small sacrifice that's made, there's that sense of pride that they did it and that they were making an effort to help their kids.
So it's obvious that you are a person who was raised with a lot of sense of passion and also a sense of giving back. I've had a chance to talk briefly with your parents, heard about them. I think it's clear that you got some of that pretty early on. There's a scene in your book that I love, which is when you decided to start Room to Read and you had just left Microsoft, you said, I'm just going to send an email to some friends and tell them if they want to send a few books to get it started, then they could do that. And I needed a U.S. address, so I gave my parents' address in Colorado and said, you can send a few books. And after a few weeks, your dad sent you a message, an email with the subject line, you need to get home soon, to say that there were now thousands of books in the garage. And the car was not in the garage anymore. There were thousands of books. And so I think, there are a lot of parents in this room that want to help their children become people who can pursue big dreams and do amazing things. And I wonder if there's any other, advice from your family or stories from your childhood that could help people think about, how do we raise kids who, when the big idea comes, they go for it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's the example we set, right? Kids don't listen really to words, right? They follow the example. And like for myself, I remember if we heard a fire whistle in the middle of the night, my father was often up, because if there was a fire, he was making coffee and putting teddy bears in the trunk and going, so if that family had lost their home, he was able to give coffee to the firemen and give a teddy bear to a kid who was watching their home go up. My mother is like really into quilting, and she makes sure that, I don't remember which hospital it is, but there's kids who are literally dying of cancer, and my mom wants every one of them to have a quilt. So they just have something that they can just, clutch onto and let these kids know somebody cares about them. And so I think that the only way to really raise kids who are caring is to be caring yourself and to just live that example. And I feel very lucky, because when a lot of people didn't believe in Room to Read, my parents said, we believe in you, go for it. You're gonna be great. It may take you a while. And I think that as parents, we should just do everything in our power to not just encourage our kids, but the kids will only believe it if they see us living that example.
That's great advice. So it's hard to think about, you're so close to people in Nepal, and that's sort of where this all began for you, and it's hard to think about it without thinking about the earthquakes that they experienced and all the devastation this spring. When I spent time there, you say the Get Stuff Done. We are a children's organization. Get Stuff Done. I was really impressed with the Get Stuff Done resilience of people there, but also the devastation in some places. The destruction was, it was obviously going to take lifetimes to fix it. Can you talk a little bit about how the people that you are working with are doing and ways that Room to Read has been involved, or any stories from that recovery.
Yeah, so I mean, Nepal, there's only one positive thing about the earthquake that hit Nepal in late April, and that's that it happened on a Saturday afternoon, because Nepal lost 32,000 classrooms. 32,000 classrooms were destroyed. And if you think about that, that means over 1 million kids, if it's 30 kids per classroom, would have been in the classroom when the walls came down. And of course, this is not the world's greatest construction methodology. When people who are resource constrained build, they build with whatever's around. And quite often it's rocks and sticks and tree limbs and whatever else it might be. So 30,000 classrooms were destroyed. Over 1 million children are now in what's called temporary learning centers, or TLCs. Picture some bamboo rods with some cloth on top of them or sheet metal across the top, open to the elements. The kids are trying to learn. Room to Read itself, I was very proud of our local team. We've already put over 500,000 books into the temporary learning centers. Again, a GSD mentality that within 72 hours of the earthquake, our team was literally taking books out to the temporary learning centers, because when those kids have gone through trauma, you need to give them something positive to focus on, even if that's as simple as a children's storybook. I was in Nepal in mid-July. I was able to visit some of the villages. The good news for Room to Read is we've always used reinforced concrete construction along with a seismically stable blueprint. So our survival rate of our schools that we have built was 93% in the quake zone. We only lost 7% of our schools, whereas the schools we didn't build, that were built by other NGOs or built by the government, without our partnership, their failure rate was upwards of 70%. So our survival rate of our schools was 10x that of the norm. So that means that we now have, I think, the license to say our model works very, very well. We also are layering in literacy and teacher training. So we have now launched a campaign to rebuild. We're going to try to think big about this. We've made commitments to the government and we've made commitments to communities that we're going to rebuild 700 classrooms in the next year. We're in the middle of a big fundraising campaign right now. When I came back from Nepal, my co-founder, Dinesh, 2 weeks later emailed me and he said, John, it was good to see you. I think we're going to need to raise between $2 million and $6 million to get some serious runs on the board rebuilding schools. And I don't know where the money's going to come from, and I hate to even ask you for this because you're going to have to go fundraise this on top of what you're already doing this year. And he said between 2 and 6. I wrote back and I said, Dinesh, I heard you say 6. I didn't hear you say 2. I didn't hear you say 3. I didn't hear you say 4. I didn't hear you say 5. We have to go for 6 and really let you do the job you need to do to rebuild the classroom. So we launched this campaign in late August, imaginatively named the Nepal Earthquake Fund. And I'm very proud to say that we recently passed the $5 million milestone. So we're seeing light at the end of the tunnel. We have $1 million to go.
Awesome. So I could keep talking, and I've had the good fortune of talking with you, but I think, you know, you are a person who obviously has taken huge risks for something that you care very deeply about. And I've heard you say, and this is my last question for you, I've heard you say a couple times, bold ideas attract bold people. And certainly Room to Read, from everything you've talked about today, we can all see that it is a bold idea and there was a bold person and people behind it. We are lucky because today we have in this room a lot of very bold people. And I just would love if you want to say one last thing to this group. What advice do you have today for people in Colorado that are thinking about a bold idea and want to move something forward? Like, what kind of final thought would you have advice for us as we do that for kids?
I would say, first of all, kind of avoid getting too siloed, because you can have, you know, 1,000 initiatives going on at the same time, but every one of them might be small, and then you never actually get to the point of reaching scale. So I think number one is to figure out a couple of initiatives that are big enough and bold enough that if people come together, you can accomplish more, right? The whole story of Room to Read is a story of literally thousands, if not tens of thousands of people who listen to my pitch to say, that sounds cool, that's a great idea, let me help get behind that. And we basically said, let's turn Room to Read into a global movement. And so I think the world needs more of those things where if it's a statewide movement where you said, Chris, earlier, you know, what if we dared to try to cut the rate of child poverty in half? And great goal, that's a bold goal. Put a timeline on it, cut it in half, then cut it in half again, then cut it in half again, and at one point you're at 1/8 of where you originally had been. So I think bold goals, I think bold leaders, I mean, back the leaders who are going to get things done. You know, there are, in the world today, I think there are real leaders and there are fake leaders. And we know both types when we see them. And we have to make sure that the real leaders have the backing, emotional, at the board level, financial, so they can think really, really big. And I would just say for anybody, it's just like whatever you are passionate about, please go big on it. Because there's just a lot of things in the world today that are negative. And I just think there's, I mean, I don't want to sound cliche, but there's nothing more promising than the potential that's inherent in every single child, right? And that child could be in the rural western slope, they could be living in downtown Denver, they could be living in Fort Collins, they could be living in Cambodia or Nepal or South Africa. But every kid has this inherent dignity and this inherent optimism. And if you can reach them at a young age, it's just completely foundational. My favorite quote is from Archimedes, who said, "Give me a lever long enough and I can move the earth." And to me, and it was kind of echoed in that opening, that wonderful opening video, where you talk about this is the highest return on investment, this is the greatest thing you can do. And I'll close with just a quote from one of my friends, Jeff Balin, who's an executive coach out of Vancouver. Jeff did his MBA at Kellogg, as did I, but became a bit of a Buddhist scholar living in Nepal and Tibet. And I once asked Jeff, what do you think is a secret to life? You've studied Buddhism, is there a secret to life? And Jeff said, oh yeah, that's easy. That one's easy. I said, how is that easy, the secret of life? And he said, no, it's really easy. He said, the secret to life is figure out what you want to say on your deathbed and work backwards from there. And if what you're doing today is in alignment with what you want to say on your deathbed, then stop worrying about it and just do it. And if it's not in alignment with what you want to say on your deathbed, then you better start getting aligned, because time passes very, very quickly. And so my thing I want to say on my deathbed is I want to basically be able to say, and I hope that it's still 40 plus years in the future that I'm having this little scene play out. But what I want to say is I want to say that Room to Read worked to make sure that we forever ended this whole idea that there is a lottery of life, that you can be born in the wrong place at the wrong time and therefore not get an education and therefore be one more generation to remain stuck in perpetual poverty. We want to end the lottery of life and say to every single kid, you were there at the right place at the right time because we were there for you and we were holding your hand and we were helping you to get literate and we're helping to make sure there's gender equality in schools. Everyone in this room can probably go home tonight. Maybe it's a fun family conversation. Maybe not fun if you're talking about the deathbed, but maybe it's motivating to say, what do you want to say at the end of your years? You're going to hit a certain point where you're older and you're looking and I would just say, don't have regrets. If you want to do something big, do it and do it with passion and don't let anybody talk you out of it, because we're in this room, I think we're the best hope for kids everywhere, whether they be here in Colorado, whether they be somewhere in a low-income country in the developing world. But I would just say, think big, be bold. Bold goals do attract bold people, so throw out the bold goal, build your coalition, and I'll, go big.
Love that.
Thank you.
Well, again, we do have the people in the room to do that, and so it means so much that we had you here. And there is a word in Nepal that means thank you and blessings, and we just are so grateful for everything that you've brought, and that is namaste. So namaste to you, John Wood.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Thank you very much.
I hope you all enjoyed hearing from John Wood. I know I did. And hopefully you've all been inspired to make an impact. The Room to Read program has helped 10 million kids and counting. That's awesome. And hopefully you're all challenged to consider your own roles in nurturing your own ideas, your bright ideas. John has graciously autographed copies of his best-selling book, Leaving Microsoft to Change the World, which was featured on Oprah, but it was also featured here today in Colorado, named by Amazon as one of the top 10 business narratives. The books are on sale downstairs, so right by the front door, so stop and get one. A great Christmas present or Hanukkah present too, so get one of those and a couple and hand them out. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for including me today. I was inspired, and I think everybody in this room was. Have an awesome day. Go do something big.